Dr. Langston Reed, a successful black heart surgeon, finds himself in a heated battle against a corrupt and racist police officer, Officer Burrows, who unjustly arrests a young black boy, Marcus Mitchell, over fabricated charges. Burrows' abuse of power, fueled by systemic prejudice, reveals a pattern of targeting marginalized families in their small town. Despite being underestimated and disrespected, Langston refuses to back down, risking everything to expose the lies, corruption, and deep-rooted racism. As tensions rise, the story highlights the infuriating reality of racism in America and the fight to hold those in power accountable. The courthouse in Danton, Georgia, was as old as the town itself, a square brick building with white columns that stood like sentinels at its entrance. A tired American flag swayed half-heartedly above the doorway, its edges frayed from years of stubborn neglect. Inside, the air was heavy with the mingling scents of coffee, dust, and humidity. The ceiling fans buzzed faintly, offering little relief from the oppressive heat that clung to every surface. Dr. Langston Reed pushed open the wide wooden door, his polished black shoes echoing softly against the tiled floor. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a tailored navy suit that whispered quiet authority, Langston might have looked intimidating to some. But there was a humility in his movements, a gentleness in the way. He nodded politely to the clerk at the front desk that made it clear his power wasn't something he wielded carelessly. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove. Langston was a world-renowned heart surgeon. The son of a mechanic and a schoolteacher, he'd risen to the top of his field through sheer determination and an unshakable belief in hard work. People came from all over the country to seek his care. He'd saved lives that others had given up on. Newspapers had called him the Miracle Doctor, a title he never much cared for. He was just doing his job, saving hearts, one patient at a time. And yet, here he was, in a rundown courthouse in rural Georgia, where no one knew, or cared, who he was. Langston hadn't come to Danton for fame or fortune. He'd come because sometimes a fight found you, no matter how far you tried to run. He was here for Marcus Mitchell, a teenager from Danton who'd been accused of stealing a bicycle from the mayor's nephew. It was a ridiculous charge, one that wouldn't hold up in a real courtroom with real evidence. But in Danton, where racial biases ran deeper than the roots of the old oak trees lining the streets, facts didn't always matter. Marcus's mother, Evelyn, had reached out to Langston through an old family friend. "You're the only one who can help him, Dr. Reed," she had said, her voice trembling with quiet desperation. Langston hadn't hesitated. He might have left the small town south decades ago, but he knew exactly what a place like Danton could do to a boy like Marcus if no one stood in his corner. He didn't come for praise. He came because it was the right thing to do. As Langston stepped into the main hallway, he felt the eyes on him before he even looked up. The people of Danton had a way of staring without staring, eyes flicking toward him, then darting away quickly, as if they didn't want to be caught looking. A group of men in work boots and flannel shirts leaned against the far wall, their conversation quieting as Langston passed. A woman in a faded floral dress clutched her purse a little tighter, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. Langston ignored it, as he always did. He'd faced this kind of scrutiny his entire life, and he'd long since learned not to let it distract him. At the far end of the hall, the courtroom doors opened, and a man in a sheriff's uniform stepped out. His nameplate read, Officer Burrows. But it was the look on his face that caught Langston's attention. A thin-lipped frown, the kind reserved for strangers who didn't belong. "You lost, sir?" Officer Burrows asked, his tone dripping with faux politeness. Langston stopped, standing tall but relaxed. He offered a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "No, I'm right where I'm supposed to be, Dr. Langston Reed. I'm here to speak on behalf of Marcus Mitchell." Burrows raised an eyebrow, his gaze drifting pointedly over Langston's suit. "A doctor, huh?" He said it slowly, as though he didn't quite believe it. "That's right." For a beat, Burrows didn't move. The hallway grew quieter, the murmurs of conversation dimming as people turned to watch the exchange. Langston knew this game. Burrows was sizing him up, deciding whether to treat him like a man or dismiss him like something less. Finally, the officer nodded stiffly. "Courtroom's open," Burrows said, stepping aside. "Go on in." Langston held his gaze for just a moment longer, then nodded and walked past him, his shoes clicking confidently against the floor. He didn't look back, but he could feel Burrows' eyes on him the whole way. Inside, the courtroom was no different from the rest of the courthouse. Faded wood paneling, benches that creaked when you moved, and a judge's bench that looked too big for the room. A row of old ceiling fans spun lazily overhead, stirring the warm air like an afterthought. Marcus sat at the defense table with his mother beside him, her hands gripping his tightly. He looked small and frightened in his ill-fitting dress shirt, his shoulders hunched as though he were trying to disappear into himself. When he saw Langston, his eyes widened with relief. Langston crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, jurors, court officials, and locals who had come to watch the proceedings, like it was a Sunday sermon. At the prosecutor's table sat Roy Hendricks, the mayor's nephew, his smug expression making it clear he was certain of the outcome. Langston lowered himself into the chair beside Marcus and offered the boy a reassuring nod. "You okay, son?" he asked softly. Marcus nodded, though his voice shook when he whispered, "Yes, sir." Langston turned his attention to the judge, a balding man with thin-rimmed glasses and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. His name was Judge Alton Whitaker, a man Langston had heard of before. Whitaker had a reputation for being lenient with certain people and unforgiving with others, depending on how they looked. "Is the defense ready to proceed?" Judge Whitaker asked. Langston stood, his voice calm but firm. "We are, Your Honor." "Name for the record?" "Dr. Langston Reed." A murmur spread through the room, as if the title alone was something scandalous. Judge Whitaker peered over his glasses, his brow furrowing slightly. "You're a doctor, Mr. Reed?" Langston's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Yes, Your Honor. A surgeon, actually." Another ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. Langston ignored it. He wasn't here to play their games. The prosecutor, a wiry man with thinning hair and a voice like a rusty nail, stood and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, this is a simple case of theft. The evidence is clear. Marcus Mitchell was seen riding a bicycle belonging to the mayor's nephew. That's theft, plain and simple." Langston rose slowly, his gaze steady. "Your Honor, with all due respect, there's nothing simple about this case. There's no proof the bicycle was stolen. Marcus Mitchell was given the bike by a neighbor who thought it had been abandoned." Roy Hendricks snorted from the prosecutor's table, his voice cutting through the silence. "Doesn't change the fact he had it." Langston turned, his gaze landing on the smirking young man. "And it doesn't change the fact that no one bothered to ask Marcus's side of the story before dragging him into this courtroom." Judge Whitaker banged his gavel. "Order!" Langston sat back down, his jaw tight. He could feel the tension rising in the room, the unspoken biases pressing down like a storm cloud, ready to break. Marcus's mother squeezed her son's hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She was holding on to hope, because Langston was here. But Langston knew hope wasn't always enough in a place like Danton. He leaned closer to Marcus and whispered, "It's going to be okay. Trust me." And in that moment, as the murmurs faded and the room grew still, Langston knew one thing. This fight was just beginning. The courtroom settled into a hushed quiet, broken only by the occasional scrape of a chair or a whispered comment from the back benches. The judge's gavel had stilled the room, but Langston could feel the tension tightening like an invisible rope. Every movement, every word seemed amplified, heavy with unspoken judgments. He turned slightly to glance at Marcus. The boy was holding himself rigid, hands clasped tightly in his lap, his eyes fixed straight ahead. His mother sat beside him, her face carefully composed, though her knuckles had gone white where she gripped the edge of the table. It was a mother's stoic fear, silent but all-consuming. Langston took a slow breath, steadying himself. This wasn't his first fight for someone who had been wronged, but it felt different here, more personal. The air in Danton was thick with a history no one spoke of but everyone knew, a history that still clung to people. Like Marcus, boys like him didn't get the benefit of the doubt in places like this. The prosecutor, Mr. Adams, rose from his seat, smoothing his tie as though preparing for a performance. He was a wiry man with small, beady eyes that darted toward Langston with thinly veiled disdain. "Your Honor," Adams began, his voice pitched with artificial gravity, The defense keeps saying there's no proof of theft, but let's focus on what we do know. He pivoted toward the jury, his steps slow and deliberate. We have the mayor's nephew here as a witness. He says the bicycle was stolen, and we have the boy. He jabbed a finger in Marcus's direction without even looking at him. Caught red-handed, riding it through town. Those are the facts. Anything else is just noise. Langston stood calmly as the judge nodded for him to proceed. He adjusted his cuffs as he walked toward the center of the room, his movements controlled but deliberate, a visual contrast to Adams's theatricality. Your Honor, Langston began smoothly, his voice low but commanding. The prosecution claims to have facts, but let's examine those facts for what they really are. First, we have a bicycle. Was Marcus Mitchell seen riding it? Yes. But what the prosecution hasn't told you is why. Adams cut in with a smirk. Because he stole it? Langston turned his head slightly, pinning the prosecutor with a calm but sharp gaze. Do you have proof of that, Mr. Adams, beyond your witness's word? Adams faltered for half a second before waving dismissively. We have testimony. Langston held up a hand. Testimony from one person, Roy Hendricks, the mayor's nephew. A man with personal ties to power in this town. Convenient, isn't it? Objection, Adams barked, his face reddening. Relevance. Judge Whitaker looked up lazily from his notes. Sustained. Let's not make this personal, Dr. Reed. Langston didn't miss the emphasis on doctor. A subtle dig, as if the title didn't belong to him. He bit back the rising anger, his voice remaining steady. Understood, Your Honor. Langston returned to the table, resisting the urge to glance at the jury. He could feel their eyes, some curious, others wary. In a town like Danton, a black man in a tailored suit stood out like a lighthouse on a foggy shore. He could almost hear the whispers. Who does he think he is? The prosecutor smirked as he called his next witness. Roy Hendricks. The mayor's nephew strutted to the stand with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned a day in his life. He was in his early 20s, with sandy blonde hair and the kind of smug expression that came from knowing the world was always tilted in your favor. Roy leaned back in the witness chair, hands folded across his lap. Yeah, I saw him, he said lazily. Riding my bike down Main Street like he owned it. And you're certain it was yours? Adams prompted. Roy grinned. Of course I bought that bike 2 summers ago. It's got a scratch on the left handlebar. I'd recognize it anywhere. Langston rose to cross-examine. As he approached the stand, Roy shifted, his cockiness slipping just slightly. Langston's calm presence had that effect. Mr. Hendricks, Langston began, you say you're certain this was your bicycle. Did you file a report about it being missing? Roy blinked, clearly unprepared for the question. Well, no, he admitted, but it wasn't gone that long. I noticed it was missing that afternoon, and then I saw him riding it. And did you see Marcus take it? Roy's brow furrowed. No, but, Langston pressed on. So you didn't see him take it. You didn't report it missing, and you're telling us that a bike you didn't notice was gone, until you happened to see someone riding it, was stolen. Roy shifted uncomfortably. Yeah, I mean, it's obvious. To you, maybe. Langston paused for emphasis, but the fact remains, you assumed Marcus Mitchell stole it. Roy's lips thinned, and Langston knew he had him. He turned and walked back to his seat, but not before catching the flash of anger in the judge's eyes. Judge Whitaker didn't like where this was going, and Langston knew exactly why. The trial dragged on into the afternoon. Langston called Evelyn Mitchell, Marcus's mother, to testify. She spoke quietly but firmly about how Marcus had been given the bicycle by a neighbor. The prosecution pushed back, of course, painting the story as convenient and unverified. Langston argued that Marcus's word was just as valid as Roy Hendricks, but the room's energy told him no one else saw it that way. It wasn't the evidence they were judging. It was Marcus himself. During a short recess, Langston stepped outside the courtroom for some air. The humidity hit him like a wall, heavy and unforgiving. He loosened his tie, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. Dr. Reed, a voice drawled behind him. Langston turned to find Officer Burrows, the sheriff's deputy, leaning casually against a pillar, arms crossed. What can I do for you, officer? Langston asked, his tone polite but distant. Burrows studied him for a long moment, the corner of his mouth twitching into a half-smile. I've been in this town a long time, seen a lot of folks come and go, but you're different. How so? Burrows shrugged. Men like you think you can walk in here, flash that fancy title, and change the way things are. But it doesn't work like that. Langston's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. You're right about one thing. I am different. I came here to help a young man who's being railroaded, and I won't stop until the truth is heard. Burrows chuckled lowly, shaking his head. Suit yourself. But this town has its own way of doing things, Dr. Reed. Don't forget that. Langston watched as Burrows turned and strolled back inside, his words settling like a layer of ash over the afternoon heat. Back in the courtroom, Langston sat quietly as Adams delivered his closing arguments. The prosecutor spoke with conviction, painting Marcus as a boy who knew better, but chose wrong. The words were subtle, but Langston recognized the dog whistles, coded phrases that played on fears and stereotypes. When it was Langston's turn, he rose slowly and approached the jury, his expression calm but unyielding. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice steady, I want you to ask yourselves one question. If Marcus Mitchell looked different, if he came from a different family, would we even be here right now? The room stilled. This case isn't about a stolen bicycle, it's about assumptions, it's about who we believe and why. Langston turned, his gaze sweeping the jury. Marcus Mitchell is not the villain here. He's a boy, someone's son, someone's future, and he deserves the same presumption of innocence as anyone else. He paused, letting the words hang in the air before returning to his seat. As Judge Whitaker instructed the jury and recessed for deliberation, Langston sat back, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He glanced at Marcus, whose eyes brimmed with uncertainty. Langston leaned over and whispered, Whatever happens, we'll face it together. Stay strong. But even as he said the words, he felt the storm gathering. In a town like Danton, justice was far from guaranteed. Langston sat stiffly in the courtroom, his eyes fixed on the jury foreman. As he rose to deliver the verdict, Marcus's mother, Evelyn, gripped her son's hand so tightly it looked painful, her lips moving silently in prayer. Marcus sat still, his thin shoulders hunched forward, his eyes staring blankly at the table. Langston wasn't a praying man, but in that moment, he felt the weight of hope and despair pressing down on him all at once. Please, let them see the truth. The jury foreman, a stocky man with weathered skin and a stoic expression, cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the silent courtroom. We, the jury, find the defendant, Marcus Mitchell. The pause stretched longer than it should have. Guilty of theft. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a murmur of voices. Evelyn let out a strangled sob, clutching Marcus to her chest as though she could shield him from what was happening. Marcus's face crumbled, his disbelief clear, as tears began to roll down his cheeks. Langston felt his stomach drop, his chest tightening with fury and disbelief. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. He knew this was a possibility. He'd seen the way Judge Whitaker's gaze lingered on Marcus, the way the jurors had avoided looking at the boy's mother during the trial. But knowing it could happen didn't make it any easier. Judge Whitaker adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, his expression devoid of emotion. The court will reconvene tomorrow for sentencing. Marcus Mitchell is hereby remanded into custody. Langston's head snapped up. Your Honor, that's unnecessary. Marcus poses no threat and has strong ties to the community. Judge Whitaker's gaze settled on Langston, cold and unyielding. The jury has spoken, Dr. Reed. The boy will remain in custody until sentencing. The gavel banged, the sound final and crushing. Marcus was too stunned to fight as two uniformed deputies approached him. The first, Officer Burrows, grabbed Marcus roughly by the arm, yanking him out of his chair. Evelyn sprang to her feet, her voice rising in panic. Don't touch him like that, he's just a boy. Langston stood, his voice calm but commanding. That's enough. There's no need to handle him like a criminal. Burrows turned slowly, his grip on Marcus tightening. You don't get to tell us how to do our job, Doctor. Langston clenched his jaw, swallowing back the sharp retort sitting on the tip of his tongue. He couldn't lose his composure, not now. He walked closer, his voice low but clear. Let him go. I'll make sure he comes back for sentencing tomorrow." Burrows smirked, his eyes gleaming with something ugly. "Sorry, but rules are rules. He's coming with us now." Langston's fists clenched at his sides as Burrows marched Marcus toward the back of the courtroom. The boy looked over his shoulder, his wide eyes locking on Langston's. "Dr. Reed, please don't let them take me." Langston's heart twisted, but he forced himself to stay calm. He followed closely, stopping just before Burrows reached the door, leading to the holding cells. "This is unnecessary, and you know it." Burrows turned abruptly, stepping close enough that Langston could smell the coffee on his breath. "What's unnecessary is you sticking your nose where it doesn't belong," he said, his voice a low hiss. "You might think you're somebody because of that fancy suit and title, but in this town, we know how to handle troublemakers." Langston's eyes narrowed, his voice deadly quiet. "You don't get to define who belongs here, and Marcus Mitchell is no troublemaker, but you're a disgrace to that badge." Burrows' face turned a deep red, his fists tightening at his sides. But before he could say another word, a second officer stepped in. "Let's move, Burrows. The judge wants this wrapped up." Burrows cast Langston one final glare before shoving Marcus through the door. The boy's cries echoed faintly down the hall, each one slicing deeper into Langston's resolve. The courthouse emptied quickly after the verdict, as if no one wanted to linger too long around the lingering sense of injustice. Evelyn sat slumped in one of the benches, her face buried in her hands, silent sobs shaking her shoulders. Langston approached her slowly, kneeling so he could meet her gaze. "I'm so sorry, Evelyn," he said softly. She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her eyes hollow with grief. "How could they do this? My baby didn't do anything wrong." Langston took her hand gently, his voice steady. "We're not done, I promise you. I'm not done fighting for him." Evelyn searched his face for a long moment before nodding weakly. "What can we do?" Langston hesitated for just a moment before his resolve solidified. "We find the truth. Whatever it takes, I'll expose what's really happening here." He stood, pulling his phone from his pocket as he dialed a number. Mitchell, the hesitant court clerk who had quietly expressed sympathy earlier, picked up on the second ring. "Langston Reed," he said briskly, walking toward the exit. "I need information. Anything you can find on this so-called theft, Burrows, and Roy Hendricks. This whole case stinks of corruption." There was a long pause before Mitchell's hesitant voice came through. "You know you're playing with fire, Dr. Reed. These people, they don't like being challenged." Langston's voice was firm. "I didn't come here to make friends, Mitchell. I came here for justice." The hours after the verdict stretched into a restless blur of phone calls and digging through every thread of information Langston could find. He sat in his rented motel room, stacks of legal documents and printouts spread across the small table. As the clock crept toward midnight, a knock on the door startled him. Langston stood cautiously, glancing through the peephole before opening the door. It was Mitchell, the clerk, clutching a folder close to his chest. "You're lucky I'm even here," Mitchell said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "If they find out I gave you this—" "They won't," Langston promised, stepping aside to let him in. Mitchell dropped the folder on the table and rubbed his face, clearly anxious. "I shouldn't be doing this, but you're right. Something's not adding up." Langston opened the folder, his sharp eyes scanning the contents. What he saw made his blood run cold. There it was. Evidence that Roy Hendricks had reported the bike missing days after Marcus was arrested. Further documents showed Officer Burrows had arrested other black teenagers on similar flimsy accusations. Cases that mysteriously disappeared after parents paid steep fines. It was a pattern. "This isn't about a stolen bike," Langston muttered, more to himself than Mitchell. "This is a racket. They're targeting innocent kids, charging them with petty crimes, and profiting off their families' desperation." Mitchell nodded grimly. "Burrows and the mayor's office are tied together. It's dirty, but no one's ever had the guts to stand up to them." Langston's jaw tightened as he closed the folder. His path forward was clear. He would expose Burrows, Roy, and every corrupted cog in Danton's system. Langston barely slept that night. By sunrise, he was back at the courthouse, armed with evidence and a plan. The town square was eerily quiet, the morning mist clinging to the cobblestones like a secret no one wanted to share. As Langston approached the courthouse steps, he saw Burrows leaning against his squad car, watching him with a smirk. "Bright and early, Doc," Burrows called, his voice dripping with mockery. "You don't know when to quit, do you?" Langston stopped at the base of the steps, holding the folder tightly at his side. "Oh, I don't quit, Officer Burrows. Not when the truth's on my side." Burrows' smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly, spitting onto the pavement as he pushed away from the car. "You're poking at things you shouldn't, Reed. It won't end well for you." Langston took a slow step forward, his voice steady and clear. "It won't end well for you, officer. This system you've built, this abuse of power, it ends now." Burrows' smile vanished completely, replaced by a thin line of anger. "Is that a threat?" "No," Langston said, meeting Burrows' glare without flinching. "It's a promise." Langston stared at the courthouse steps as the morning sun began to burn away the mist, bathing the square in pale gold. The stillness of the town was a facade. Beneath it, corruption and prejudice simmered like a pot ready to boil over. Officer Burrows' parting words echoed in his mind, a threat wrapped in faux confidence. Langston tightened his grip on the folder in his hand, his determination hardening like steel. "They think they can intimidate me into silence." He exhaled sharply. "Not today." As he turned, Evelyn Mitchell's car pulled up to the curb, the engine sputtering before it went quiet. She stepped out, her face etched with fatigue. She'd clearly spent the night in tears, but there was a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Dr. Reed," she called softly, hurrying over. Did you find something?" Langston nodded, his voice steady. "I found enough to blow this case wide open. We've got proof. Evelyn Roy Hendricks lied, and Burrows has been running a scheme to extort families like yours. This isn't just about Marcus anymore." Evelyn's hand shot up to cover her mouth, relief and disbelief warring on her face. "You can stop them?" Langston paused. He didn't want to make promises he couldn't keep. Not when the entire system was rigged against people like Marcus, but Evelyn deserved the truth. "I can try, and I'll fight until my last breath to make sure they don't get away with this." Her shoulders relaxed slightly as she nodded. "We'll be right here with you." Inside the courthouse, the air felt heavier than usual. Langston had barely stepped through the doors before a voice stopped him cold. Well, look who's back." Officer Burrows leaned lazily against the hallway wall, arms crossed over his chest, and that smug, ever-present grin plastered on his face. Langston didn't slow his stride. He moved past Burrows without a word. "Careful, Doc," Burrows called after him. "Poke the wrong bear, and you might not like what happens." Langston stopped mid-step, his shoulders stiffening. He turned slowly, fixing Burrows with a glare sharp enough to cut stone. "Is that another threat, Officer Burrows?" Burrows smirked. "Not a threat, just good advice." Langston stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "Let me give you some advice, officer. You've spent years terrorizing people who can't fight back, but I'm not afraid of you. Your time is up, and when the truth comes out, you'll have nowhere to hide." Burrows' smirk faltered for just a second, his jaw twitching. But before he could respond, the courtroom doors opened. "Court's in session," the bailiff barked. Langston turned and walked inside, leaving Burrows staring after him. The courtroom was full. The townspeople had gathered in anticipation of Marcus's sentencing, and the energy in the room was palpable, a mix of curiosity, contempt, and something darker. Langston took his seat at the defense table, laying the folder carefully in front of him. Marcus was brought in moments later, his wrists shackled, his face pale and drawn. The sight of the cuffs made Langston's blood boil. "You holding up?" Langston whispered, as Marcus sat beside him. Marcus nodded weakly, though his hands shook. "I'm scared." Langston placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "I'm not going to let them take you down. Son, trust me." At the front of the room, Judge Whitaker cleared his throat. "Bring this court to order." The hum of murmurs faded instantly. Whitaker adjusted his glasses and peered down at Langston. "Dr. Reed, do you have any last statements before sentencing?" Langston stood slowly, picking up the folder and stepping into the center of the room. All eyes were on him, some bored, some wary, and others, like Officer Burrows, filled with hostility. "Yes, Your Honor," Langston began, his voice clear and unshakable. I have new evidence that demands this case be reopened, and the charges against Marcus Mitchell dropped." A ripple of shock spread through the room. Judge Whittaker frowned deeply. "Dr. Reed, this case has already been decided." Langston raised a hand. "Respectfully, Your Honor, you need to see this." He stepped forward, holding out the folder. Inside this file is evidence that Officer Burrows and the prosecution's key witness, Roy Hendricks, have been involved in a pattern of misconduct, extortion, and falsifying accusations against innocent black teenagers. The room erupted into gasps and whispers. Judge Whittaker's face reddened as he banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order, I said order!" Langston's heart pounded as he turned, locking eyes with Burrows, who now stood frozen near the back of the room. His smirk was gone, replaced by a look of fury. "This file contains proof," Langston continued, his voice rising with the weight of his conviction. "Roy Hendricks never reported that bicycle missing until after Marcus was arrested. Officer Burrows has used fabricated charges to exploit families who can't afford to fight back. This isn't justice, this is corruption." "Objection!" Adams, the prosecutor, shot to his feet, his face pale. "This is outrageous, Your Honor. None of this is admissible." Langston turned sharply. "It's admissible if it's the truth, and you know it." Judge Whittaker slammed his gavel once more, his voice booming. "Enough, Dr. Reed. Step back to the table." Langston didn't move. He met the judge's glare, unflinching. "Are you going to ignore this, Your Honor? How many more innocent kids need to be thrown away before someone steps up and says enough?" The judge opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Officer Burrows stormed forward. His face was flushed, his movements erratic as he jabbed a finger in Langston's direction. "This is nonsense!" Burrows barked, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "You're trying to stir up trouble, Reed, but nobody's going to believe you." Langston turned to face him, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Burrows' rage. "The truth is already out, officer. The only question is how long you're going to deny it." "You think you're a hero?" Burrows sneered. "You don't know how things work in this town." Langston took a slow step forward, his voice dropping low. "I know exactly how things work in this town, and that's why I'm not going to stop until you're held accountable." Burrows lunged forward suddenly, his temper exploding. "You're done here, Reed!" The room gasped as two bailiffs moved to restrain Burrows, pulling him back just in time. Judge Whittaker's face was ashen, his gavel frozen mid-air. For a long moment, the courtroom was silent, everyone staring at the scene that had just unfolded. Langston turned, his voice calm but ringing with authority. "This case needs to be thrown out, Your Honor, and I suggest you start asking questions about Officer Burrows' conduct before this entire courthouse becomes a scandal." Judge Whittaker stared at him, torn between disbelief and growing alarm. Finally, he cleared his throat, though his voice was shaky. "This court will recess. I will review the evidence." Langston nodded, but he knew this was far from over. He turned to Marcus and Evelyn, his voice low but reassuring. "We've cracked it open. They can't ignore it now." Evelyn's eyes brimmed with tears as she whispered, "You think they'll let my baby go?" Langston looked at Marcus, the boy's fear giving way to a flicker of hope. "They'll have no choice," Langston said. "Not after this." As the courtroom emptied, Langston stood by the defense table, his hands resting on the file that now held the weight of the town's darkest secrets. Officer Burrows was nowhere to be seen. He'd been ushered out in a barely concealed storm of anger. Mitchell, the court clerk, hurried over, his face pale. "Dr. Reed, you stirred up a hornet's nest. Burrows won't let this go quietly." Langston nodded, his gaze fixed on the judge's bench, where the gavel now sat untouched. "Good," he said softly. "Because I'm done being quiet too." As Langston turned to leave, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down to see an unknown number. When he answered, a distorted voice crackled through the line. "You don't know who you're messing with, Reed, back off, or you'll regret it." Langston's jaw tightened, his pulse quickening, but he didn't flinch. He let the silence linger before answering, his voice steady. "I'm not backing down." The line went dead. Langston slipped his phone back into his pocket, the weight of the moment pressing on him like a storm cloud ready to burst. "This isn't over," he thought, "but I'm ready for whatever comes next." The sun was setting, casting long shadows across Danton's town square. Langston Reed stepped out of his car, his gaze fixed on the courthouse ahead. The building loomed, its stone walls weathered with time, and its windows staring blankly, as if indifferent to the corruption festering within tonight. It would bear witness to a reckoning. Word had spread like wildfire after the evidence surfaced. The community was beginning to stir. Whispers in diners, murmurs in the grocery aisles, and stares exchanged on street corners. Langston felt it in the air. The town was on the brink of something big. He had cracked the facade, and now it was time to tear it down. Inside, the courthouse halls were nearly empty, save for the echoes of Langston's footsteps. As he approached the judge's chambers, Mitchell, the clerk, slipped out of a side room, his face pale. "You sure about this, Dr. Reed?" Mitchell whispered, wringing his hands nervously. "They're all in there. Burrows, Whitaker, Hendricks. It's a trap if I've ever seen one." Langston paused, his jaw tightening. "I don't have a choice. If I don't push back, Marcus doesn't stand a chance, neither does anyone else." Mitchell swallowed hard, then nodded. "Be careful." Langston didn't respond. He adjusted his tie and stepped through the heavy wooden doors leading to Judge Whitaker's chambers. The air inside was thick with tension, like a storm about to break. Judge Whitaker sat at the head of the room, his face stone-cold. Officer Burrows leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, his smirk etched into his face like a permanent scar. Roy Hendricks, the so-called victim, perched nervously in a chair, a bead of sweat glistening on his brow. Langston shut the door behind him with a quiet finality, the sound echoing louder than it should have. He took a step forward, his eyes sweeping over the men who had orchestrated Marcus's fall. "Dr. Reed," Judge Whitaker said, his voice low and even, "I assume you've called this meeting for a reason. It better be worth my time." Langston's gaze landed on Burrows first, lingering there as he pulled the folder from under his arm and placed it on the desk between them. "I called this meeting because I'm done playing games," Langston said. His voice was calm, but his words hit like hammer blows. "I know what's going on here." Burrows pushed off the wall, his smirk widening. "And what's that supposed to mean?" Langston's eyes didn't waver. "This isn't about a stolen bike. This is about you, Officer Burrows, using your badge to target innocent families. Families you think can't fight back. You extort them, harass them, and ruin lives, all while hiding behind the authority of this courthouse." Judge Whitaker's expression darkened. "Careful with your accusations, Dr. Reed." Langston didn't flinch. "They're not accusations, they're facts." He opened the folder and pulled out a series of documents, sliding them across the table toward Whitaker. "Here's proof that Roy Hendricks fabricated his report days after Marcus's arrest, and here," he held up another page, "is evidence of Burrows' long history of arresting black teenagers on false charges. Every single case vanished after their families paid steep fines. A pattern." Hendricks shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face paling as Whitaker turned toward him. "You said the report was filed immediately," the judge said sharply. Roy stammered, his eyes darting to Burrows. I don't know what he's talking about. It's a misunderstanding." Langston's gaze pinned him like a nail. "No, it's not. You lied, Roy, and you've been covering for him." Burrows' voice cut through the room, sharp and venomous. "You've got a lot of nerve, Reed, throwing around words like that without knowing what you're talking about." Langston turned slowly to face him. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. You've been exploiting this town's trust for years. You hide your bigotry behind your badge, but it's all crumbling now. I have the proof. And soon, everyone will know who you really are." Burrows' smirk vanished, replaced by a twisted snarl. He stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can come in here, throw your weight around, and tear this town apart? You're an outsider, Reed. You don't belong here. People like you never do." The words hung in the air like poison, heavy with meaning. Langston's blood boiled, but he stayed calm. He'd been here before, faced men like Burrows who saw the color of his skin before the content of his character. He wouldn't let the anger win. Not this time. "People like me?" Langston repeated softly. He stepped closer to Burrows, his voice like a blade honed to a razor's edge. "No, Officer Burrows, people like you don't belong here. Not in a courthouse, not behind a badge, not in any position of power." Burrows' fists clenched at his sides, his face reddening. Watch yourself, Reed. Langston didn't move. I'm watching you, and so is everyone else. The silence in the room was deafening. Judge Whitaker's eyes flicked nervously between the two men, clearly sensing that the situation had spiraled out of control. Enough, Whitaker barked. This meeting is over, Dr. Reed. You've made your claims, but I'll remind you that I am the authority here. I'll decide what happens next. Langston turned to him, his expression unreadable. You have a choice, Judge. You can ignore this evidence, but if you do, it won't stop here. I'll take this file to the press. I'll take it to the state courts. I will not let this injustice stand. Whitaker's face drained of color. For the first time, the power in the room shifted. Langston could see it, the cracks spreading through their facade. Just then, the door to the chambers burst open, and Mitchell entered, his face flushed with panic. Judge Whitaker, you need to see this. He held up a phone. Langston glanced at the screen and felt his heart leap. Mitchell had done it. He'd leaked the story, sent the evidence to every local news outlet. What is this? Whitaker snapped as Mitchell handed him the phone. Proof, Mitchell said firmly, his voice trembling but resolute. Proof of everything Dr. Reed said. It's already spreading. The press is outside. The room erupted into chaos. Burrows turned on Mitchell, his face red with fury. You little rat! Enough! Whitaker roared, slamming his fist on the table. His breathing was heavy, his face slick with sweat, as he realized the weight of what had just happened. Langston stepped back, his gaze sweeping over the room. Burrows' face contorted with rage as he turned toward Langston. For a moment, it looked as though he might lunge, but Langston held his ground, unshaken. This isn't over, Burrows spat, his voice low. Langston's voice was steady. It is for you. Outside the courthouse, the square was packed with townspeople and reporters, their voices a low hum of curiosity and excitement. Langston stepped out, his breath slow and steady, as the cool evening air hit his face. The crowd turned toward him, eyes wide, waiting for answers. Evelyn and Marcus stood at the front, their faces filled with hope. Langston approached them, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. You're going home, son, he said softly. Marcus's face broke into a tearful smile, and Evelyn let out a quiet sob of relief. Thank you, Dr. Reed, she whispered. Langston looked back at the courthouse, where the storm was still raging inside. Whitaker would try to cover his tracks. Burrows wouldn't go quietly, but Langston had done what he'd come to do. He had exposed the truth. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned. Mitchell approached, his face still pale but relieved. You think this will be enough to stop them? He asked quietly. Langston exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the courthouse doors. It's a start. As the cameras began flashing, and the reporters' voices rose, Langston felt the weight of uncertainty settle on his shoulders. What came next was anyone's guess, but one thing was clear. The truth was out, and there was no going back now. Langston Reed stepped into the blistering afternoon sun, his eyes scanning the gathering crowd outside the courthouse. News vans had begun to line the street, cameras perched high as reporters jostled for position. Whispers hummed through the crowd. Questions, rumors, an energy building as if everyone could feel that something big was about to break. Langston adjusted his tie and walked purposefully toward the steps. His leather briefcase heavy with evidence, his heart pounding with anticipation. Every step felt like a declaration, a silent promise. Today, the truth wins. Officer Burrows stood near the entrance, his uniform crisp, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His eyes narrowed as Langston approached, lips curling into a smirk that oozed contempt. Burrows stepped forward, blocking Langston's path just as he reached the base of the steps. You've got a lot of nerve showing up here, Reed, Burrows sneered. Making a scene, stirring people up with your accusations. Langston didn't stop, didn't flinch. He walked right up to Burrows, mere inches between them. Step aside, officer. You don't intimidate me. Burrows's smirk faltered for just a moment before returning, sharper this time. Intimidate you? No, Doc, I'm just reminding you whose town this is. Langston looked him dead in the eyes, his voice as steady as steel. It's not your town anymore. Burrows leaned in, his voice dropping low. People like you come in here thinking you're better than us. You stir up trouble, and you think you're untouchable because of your title. But you're just a man, Reed. And men like you don't win. Langston's jaw tightened, but his resolve only grew. He leaned in slightly, his words cutting like a knife. The difference between us, Burrows, is that I'm not afraid of the truth. I'm not afraid of the light you hide behind that badge, because deep down, you know what you are, and now, so does everyone else. Burrows' face darkened, his composure cracking for the first time. Before he could respond, the courthouse doors swung open. The bailiff stepped out, his voice carrying across the steps. Court is now in session. All parties, please proceed inside. Langston held Burrows' gaze for a beat longer before brushing past him. Burrows stood rooted to the spot, fists clenching at his sides, the weight of Langston's words still hanging in the air. The courtroom was packed. Townspeople filled every seat, their murmurs swirling like a current of tension. On one side, Evelyn Mitchell sat in the front row, gripping her son Marcus's hand. The boy looked up at Langston with a mix of hope and fear, and Langston nodded at him, a silent promise. At the judge's bench sat Judge Whittaker, his face unreadable, but his eyes shadowed with unease. On the other side, Burrows stood near the prosecution, his lawyer stiffly shuffling through papers. Roy Hendricks slouched in a chair nearby, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Langston took his place at the defense table, the folder of evidence laid carefully before him. As the bailiff called the court to order, Judge Whittaker cleared his throat. "We are here to review the evidence submitted regarding the case of Marcus Mitchell," he said, his voice flat. "Dr. Langston Reed, you have the floor." Langston stood, his heart steady, his gaze sweeping the room as he began. "Your Honor, the case against Marcus Mitchell is built on lies, lies that have been orchestrated and perpetuated by Officer Burrows. With the support of Roy Hendricks today, I will prove it." Burrows shifted in his seat, his face carefully neutral, but Langston could see the tension in his jaw. "First," Langston continued, "let's address Roy Hendricks's report. The prosecution claims Hendricks filed a police report for his missing bicycle immediately, which led Officer Burrows to arrest Marcus. But that's not true." Langston pulled a document from his folder and handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. "Here is a time-stamped copy of the report. It wasn't filed until after Marcus was taken into custody." Gasps echoed through the room. Judge Whittaker frowned deeply, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the document. "Mr. Hendricks," Langston said, turning sharply toward him, "you claimed the bike was stolen days earlier. Why didn't you file a report immediately?" Hendricks fumbled for words, his face pale. I forgot. I didn't think it was that big of a deal until Officer Burrows told you it could be," Langston cut in. Hendricks's mouth hung open, but no words came. Langston didn't stop. "Your Honor, the arrest was fabricated, and Burrows has a history of targeting young black men with false charges. Families have been threatened, extorted, and silenced for years." The room erupted in hushed conversations, tension spiking. Burrows shot to his feet. "Objection! These claims are baseless." Langston turned to face him, his voice sharp and clear. "Are they? Because I have sworn statements, Officer Burrows' families, who were afraid to speak up, but finally came forward. They detail your threats, your lies, and the money you've taken under the table to make cases disappear." Judge Whittaker's gavel came down hard. "Order!" Burrows' face turned crimson, and his composure finally shattered. "This is a damn witch hunt!" he shouted, pointing at Langston. "You think you can ruin my name, my career, because you think you're better than me? You're nothing!" "Enough!" Judge Whittaker roared, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Officer Burrows, sit down!" Langston stared Burrows down, unflinching. "Your Honor, the only thing ruining Officer Burrows' career is his own actions." Burrows slumped back into his seat, seething but silent. Langston turned back to the judge. "The evidence is clear. Marcus Mitchell is innocent, and this court must dismiss the charges immediately. But more than that, this corruption, this abuse of power, can't be ignored any longer." Judge Whittaker sat back in his chair, his expression heavy. He looked out over the packed courtroom, as if grappling with the weight of what had just been exposed. Finally, he spoke. "This court will recess to review the evidence." He banged the gavel. "Court is adjourned." As the crowd began to filter out of the courtroom, Burrows shoved his way toward Langston, his face a mask of fury. "This isn't over, Reed," Burrows spat, his voice low and venomous. "You've embarrassed me in front of this whole town, and you'll pay for it." Langston held his ground, his voice calm but unyielding. "You did this to yourself. The truth has a way of catching up to people like you." Burrows stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think you've won? You think anyone will take your word over mine? This town will bury you before they let someone like you take me down." Langston stared him down, his pulse steady. "Then let them try, I'm not going anywhere." Before Burrows could respond, the bailiffs moved in, ushering him away. Evelyn and Marcus approached, tears in their eyes. "Dr. Reed," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "You saved him." Langston looked down at Marcus, whose wide, hopeful eyes met his. "It's not over yet," Langston said quietly, "but we're not backing down." Outside the courthouse, the square was alive with reporters shouting questions and townspeople watching intently. Langston stood at the top of the steps, his briefcase in hand, his shoulders squared. The fight wasn't over. Burrows was dangerous. Men like him didn't go quietly, and Judge Whitaker's final decision still loomed, but the tide had shifted. The people had seen the truth, and there was no turning back now. As the cameras flashed and the questions rang out, Langston lifted his head high, his voice carrying over the crowd. "This is only the beginning. The fight for justice doesn't end here." The crowd stirred, whispers spreading like wildfire. Evelyn squeezed Marcus's hand as they stood beside Langston, a small family at the center of a storm. Langston looked out over the crowd, his resolve unshakable. Whatever came next, he was ready. The truth had been set free. And now, it was time to see what the world would do with it. 3 days after the storm inside the courthouse, Langston Reed sat in the same stiff-backed chair at the defense table, his briefcase resting beside him. This time, the atmosphere in the courtroom felt different. It buzzed with anticipation, as if the town held its breath, waiting to see if justice would finally prevail. Judge Whitaker's face remained stoic as he shuffled a stack of papers in front of him. Langston could see the weight of the decision on his shoulders, though Whitaker was doing his best to appear unshaken. Evelyn Mitchell sat in the front row, her hand resting protectively on Marcus's shoulder. Behind them, familiar faces, neighbors, reporters, and community members, had filled every seat. And on the other side of the courtroom sat Officer Burrows. His usual smug confidence had cracked. He was slumped slightly in his chair, his lawyer whispering, hurried reassurances that rang hollow in the tension-filled room. Langston didn't look at Burrows. He kept his eyes forward, his focus on the path ahead. "Order in the court," the bailiff called, as Judge Whitaker straightened in his chair. The room fell silent. Whitaker cleared his throat. "After reviewing the evidence and testimony presented in this case, the charges against Marcus Mitchell are hereby dismissed." The collective gasp was followed by cheers. Evelyn clapped a hand over her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. Marcus looked stunned for a moment before a wide smile broke across his face, his eyes darting to Langston. Langston allowed himself a small smile of triumph, though he remained seated, his hands folded calmly in front of him. The judge's voice cut through the celebration. "Furthermore, in light of the evidence implicating Officer Burrows in a pattern of misconduct and abuse of power, I am recommending a formal investigation into his actions." Burrows shot to his feet, his lawyer grabbing his arm. "This is a joke!" Burrows barked, his face red with rage. "These lies! This setup! Officer Burrows!" Whitaker's gavel came down hard. "Sit down, or I will hold you in contempt." Burrows sank back into his seat, his fists clenched tightly, but the damage was done. The murmurs in the crowd were louder now, and Langston could feel it. People were seeing Burrows for what he was. Judge Whitaker continued, his tone firm but weary. "This court is adjourned pending further action by the State Board." He slammed the gavel one final time. Langston stood slowly, turning to face Evelyn and Marcus as they rushed toward him. Evelyn threw her arms around Langston, her voice breaking as she said, "Thank you. Thank you for saving my boy." Langston knelt down to Marcus's level, looking him in the eye. "You're free now, Marcus. Never let anyone make you feel less than you are." Marcus nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I won't, I promise." The fallout was swift and public. Within days, Officer Burrows was suspended pending an official investigation, his record exposed in local news reports and circulated on social media. His history of targeting black teenagers and coercing families for fines could no longer be swept under the rug. Angry town meetings were held, calls for Burrows' removal ringing louder with each passing day. Langston watched the news coverage from his home, seeing crowds of people standing in front of the police department, their voices demanding change. It was a small town, but the movement felt massive, like a ripple spreading outward. Burrows tried to fight back. Interviews filled with denials, claims of being set up, accusations that Langston had orchestrated a witch hunt. But the evidence was undeniable. Change doesn't come quietly, Langston muttered to himself, watching Burrows' angry face on the screen. The man who had been untouchable was now exposed. A week after the verdict, Langston met Evelyn and Marcus at their home. The modest house looked brighter somehow, as if the weight that had hung over it had finally lifted. Evelyn greeted Langston with a warm smile, her eyes clear of the worry that had clouded them for so long. "Dr. Reed," she said, guiding him to the small kitchen table, "we owe you so much." "You don't owe me anything," Langston said gently. "Marcus deserved justice, and I did what needed to be done." Marcus appeared in the doorway, a backpack slung over his shoulder. "Guess what, Dr. Reed?" he said, his face lighting up with excitement. "I got accepted into the mentorship program downtown. They're going to teach me coding and computer stuff, like what you do." Langston smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "That's amazing, Marcus. You'll be great at it." Evelyn placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, her voice soft. "You've inspired him. He talks about being like you one day. Someone who stands up for others." Langston looked at Marcus and nodded. "You already are, Marcus. Never forget that." The weeks turned into months, and the story didn't die. The exposure of Burrows and his network of corruption sparked conversations across the state. Langston was invited to speak at community meetings, where people shared their own stories of injustice, finally feeling brave enough to come forward. The town's police department underwent investigations, leadership changes, and mandatory retraining programs. It wasn't perfect, change never was, but it was a start. Langston sat in on several of those meetings, watching as young officers listened carefully, as older ones squirmed under the weight of accountability. It wasn't easy work, but it was necessary. Mitchell, the timid courthouse clerk, became more vocal in his role, advocating for transparency and fairness within the local judicial system. He often stopped Langston to say, "You changed things around here, Dr. Reed." Langston always shook his head. "I didn't change things, we did." One evening, Langston sat alone in his study, the house quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. He leaned back in his chair, a folder of new casework resting on his desk, and let his gaze wander to the family photo on the wall. His father's face looked back at him, strong, proud, unyielding. For years, Langston had carried his father's lessons in silence. That strength meant enduring, that justice was often slow and imperfect, that you had to be willing to fight battles even when the odds were against you. But this case, this town, had taught him something else, that sometimes silence had to be broken. He picked up the phone and dialed a familiar number. It rang twice before a voice answered. "Langston?" "Hey, Mom," he said softly. "I wanted to tell you, I think Dad would have been proud today." There was a pause, and then his mother's voice came, steady and warm. "He's always been proud of you, and so am I." Langston smiled, a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying finally lifting. Months later, Langston stood at the edge of a small park that had been built in Marcus Mitchell's neighborhood. Children played in the grass, their laughter carrying on the breeze. At the center of the park was a plaque that read, "Justice grows where courage takes root." Langston watched as Marcus ran up to a group of younger kids, showing them how to build a small robot from a kit. The boy's face was lit up with excitement, his confidence evident. Evelyn stood nearby, watching her son with pride. Langston exhaled, a slow smile tugging at the corners of his lips. The scars of injustice were still there, on this town, on its people, but so was something new. Hope. He turned and walked toward his car, his phone buzzing with a new message from an organization asking him to speak at a statewide conference on justice reform. Langston opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, his path clear, his resolve unshaken. The fight for justice wasn't over. It never would be. But as Langston drove away, he felt certain of one thing. Change had begun. Langston Reed sat alone on a park bench, the early morning sunlight filtering through the trees in golden streaks. The town was quieter than usual, as if the past months of upheaval and revelations had finally brought a brief sense of calm. The air smelled of dew and cut grass, carrying a softness that seemed to blanket the small park, Marcus Mitchell's park. Langston watched as Marcus raced across the grass, his laughter carrying on the breeze. The boy was no longer the frightened child who had been dragged unfairly into the system. He was confident now, his shoulders back, his smile easy. Nearby, Evelyn Mitchell stood with a group of other mothers, their conversations light as they watched their children play. Langston leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, and let the moment soak in. The road to this point had been long, steep, and unforgiving. But this peace, felt earned. The events of the past few months had changed Langston in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had always been a man of quiet strength, someone who fought his battles with precision and intellect rather than anger. But this fight had been different. It had been personal, a reckoning not just for Marcus, but for an entire town's sense of justice. Langston thought back to the first day he walked into Millbrook, the small town that had underestimated him, a black heart surgeon who had worked tirelessly to earn every piece of success he had achieved. He hadn't expected much from Millbrook beyond a quiet life and a chance to give back. But what he'd encountered was a stark reminder that progress was fragile. Racism didn't always scream. Sometimes it whispered through the cracks, hid behind uniforms, or slipped quietly into policy and routine. Officer Burrows hadn't just targeted Marcus, he had targeted others for years, people whose voices had been silenced by fear or by the belief that no one would listen. Langston had always known these systems existed, but this time, he hadn't been able to look away. He couldn't. The cost was too high. Marcus's face had reminded him of his younger self, of the times when the world had tried to tell him he was less than, that his worth could be measured by the color of his skin. But someone had once fought for Langston, and now it had been his turn to fight for Marcus. He had stepped into the fire because someone had to, and in doing so, Langston had learned something important. Silence was no longer an option. Change came at a cost, but sometimes the cost was worth it. Langston's confrontation with Officer Burrows had become more than a local scandal. It had sparked conversations far beyond Millbrook. Newspapers picked up the story, headlines screaming about corruption, racial profiling, and a town finally forced to reckon with its shadows. The small courtroom battle had exposed systemic cracks that had been ignored for years. Burrows had been the face of a problem much bigger than himself, one that stretched into policies, leadership, and attitudes that shaped how towns like Millbrook operated. Langston had received letters from parents, teenagers, and even other doctors, people who thanked him for being a voice when they had none. Some wrote about their own Burrowses, the ways they had been humiliated, dismissed, or mistreated. Others simply shared their gratitude, hopeful that his actions had ignited a flame of accountability. But Langston didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a man who had done what needed to be done. He hadn't defeated the system. The fight was far from over, but the silence had been broken, and sometimes, that was the hardest step of all. "Dr. Reed?" Langston opened his eyes to find Marcus standing in front of him, holding a small robot in his hands. The boy's face was bright with pride. "Look what I made," Marcus exclaimed, holding the robot up for Langston to see. The little machine whirred to life, its wheels spinning as it buzzed along the ground. Langston grinned, genuinely impressed. "That's incredible, Marcus. Did you program it yourself?" "Yeah." Marcus nodded eagerly. "They taught me how to code. I want to build bigger ones next time. Ones that can really help people." "You're already helping people, Marcus," Langston said softly, reaching out to ruffle the boy's hair. "You're showing the world what you're capable of." Marcus beamed, his smile wide and free. "Like you did?" Langston's heart swelled. "Exactly." Evelyn walked over, her expression warm and grateful as she glanced at her son, "He's been working on that all week," she said with pride. "You know he wouldn't be here if it weren't for you, Dr. Reed." Langston shook his head. "He's here because of his strength, and because of you. I just helped clear the path." Evelyn placed a hand on Langston's arm, her voice soft. "You didn't just clear the path, you gave us hope." That evening, Langston stood before a packed community hall, a room full of townspeople who had come to hear him speak. The walls buzzed with an energy that hadn't existed before, a mix of anger, reflection, and hope. Langston stepped up to the podium, his voice steady and clear. What happened to Marcus Mitchell was not an isolated incident. It wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the result of a broken system, one that failed not just Marcus, but countless others. He looked out over the crowd, his gaze unwavering. For too long, people have been told to accept things as they are, to keep quiet, to endure. But silence doesn't bring change. Speaking up does, taking action does. That's what this fight was about. The crowd nodded, murmuring agreement. Langston continued, his tone sharpening. "We cannot wait for someone else to fix these problems. We have to hold each other accountable, demand better from our leaders, and stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves." Marcus's story is just one example of what happens when good people refuse to look away. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "Change is hard, it doesn't come overnight, but it is possible, and it starts with us." Applause rippled through the crowd, people rising to their feet, their voices unified in agreement. Langston stepped back from the podium, his heart full. The work wasn't over. It never would be. But they had taken a step, a meaningful one, and that mattered. Later that night, Langston sat on his porch, looking out at the stars. The small town of Millbrook stretched around him, quiet now, but alive with potential. The old wounds of injustice would take time to heal, but the community had begun to wake up. Langston thought of his father, of the sacrifices he had made to pave the way for his son, and he thought of Marcus Mitchell, a boy who now had the freedom to dream because someone had been willing to stand up for him. Langston smiled faintly. This fight had changed him. It had reminded him of the power of resilience, of community, and of truth. He had stepped into the fire and come out stronger, clearer about who he was and what he was meant to do. The world was far from perfect. There would always be more battles to fight, more systems to challenge, more voices to amplify. But Langston was ready. He picked up his notebook and began to write, his thoughts flowing onto the page like a blueprint for the road ahead. Change starts with courage, and courage starts with us. Langston closed the notebook, set it on the table beside him, and leaned back, looking out into the night. Somewhere he knew, the next fight was waiting. But for tonight, he allowed himself to rest. The stars above him seemed brighter than before, and for the first time in a long time, Langston believed they were shining for a reason.